Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to AP US History. Today, we'll be talking about the War of 1812, a war that, though on paper ended as a draw, did a great deal to shape America in the decades and centuries to come. Now, in 1808, James Madison was elected president by a pretty comfortable margin and sworn in on March 4, 1809, but tensions were still very high between the United States, Britain, and France. And the Non-Intercourse Act banned American trade with either of those two countries. But the next year, in 1810, Congress passed a new law known as Macon's Bill No. 2. Although Nathaniel Macon himself was opposed to this bill, it was named after an earlier bill he had written, but was significantly altered. This bill, though, tentatively, in exchange for nothing yet, lifted the embargo against Britain and France, but stated that if either of them would lift their restrictions on American trade, we would reimpose our embargo on the other one. Napoleon immediately accepted, but he did not actually lift France's trade restrictions, and in fact, soon began seizing American ships once more. But the fact that America and France had even briefly made a deal angered Britain, who continued to enforce the Orders in Council, requiring all neutral ships to dock in Britain before proceeding on to Europe, where of course the French could seize any ship that had stopped in Britain. And, of course, this was not the only grievance against Britain. Britain was still impressing American sailors on the high seas, and a new generation of politicians from the South and the West was quick to point out that the British still had forts in the Northwest Territory, left over from before the American Revolution. They were supposed to have abandoned these forts almost 30 years before. And they were still supplying weapons to American Indians to discourage American settlement there. The main opponents of white settlement in the Northwest Territory were the Shawnee leader Tecumseh and his brother Tenskwatawa, known as the Prophet, who had earned the devotion of his people by predicting a solar eclipse. And then he urged his people to purify themselves, something we'll see in a number of American Indian renewal movements. He urged his people to give up alcohol, to give up European-style clothing, European foods, and manufactured goods. And the two of them had spent 15 years trying to build an alliance of all the northwestern tribes and hoped to bring in the southeastern tribes as well, in particular the Creek, to try to fight off white encroachment. And the British helped Tecumseh because they were afraid that if too many Americans moved into the Northwest, they might want to go on to Canada. And maybe the British were right to be concerned. And many Westerners and some Southerners who felt a real connection with the West wanted to expand further, and Canada did seem awfully convenient. Indeed, some Americans thought Canadians would be happy to join the United States, which was incorrect. Many Canadians were bitter loyalists, exiled from America after the Revolution, or their children, or of course French Canadians, who did not particularly trust Protestant America either. Some Jeffersonian Republican congressmen even demanded war. Most prominently, those known as war hawks, such as Henry Clay of Kentucky and John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, men whom we will see again. Indeed, fighting broke out in 1811. And having built his alliance of Indian tribes in the Northwest, Tecumseh promised the governor of the Indiana Territory, William Henry Harrison, that he did not mean to fight in Indiana, although he said he would ally with the British if Harrison attacked the Indians there. And here we can see Tecumseh in the uniform of a British general, a rank he was eventually commissioned to. And having apparently worked out a ceasefire with Governor Harrison, Tecumseh headed south to try to extend his alliance among the southern tribes. Some Creek Indians agreed to follow him, particularly after they were convinced by omens that they ought to do so. There was a great comet in the heavens in 1811, and one of the biggest earthquakes in American history, the New Madrid earthquake, which caused the earth to sink along the Mississippi River, creating Reelfoot Lake in what's now in western Tennessee, and causing church bells to ring in Boston. The Mississippi briefly flowed backwards to fill in the hole that became Reelfoot Lake after the earth cracked. Now, Harrison had believed Tecumseh when he said he had no plans to fight, and he himself had headed to Kentucky on business. But when he heard that Tecumseh was seeking more allies, he returned to Indiana and made plans to attack a major settlement under the leadership of the Prophet and called Prophetstown, located by the Tippecanoe River. As Harrison's forces approached, the Prophet asked for an overnight ceasefire so he could hold peace talks in the morning. But Harrison thought this was a trick and planned a sneak attack for the morning. And at least one of the tribes in Prophetstown, the Winnebago, did not want to talk peace and also planned their own pre-dawn attack, attacking before dawn on the 7th November, 1811. And they believed they were safe in doing this, having been taught that the Prophet's magic would protect them from the bullets of white soldiers. So they surrounded Harrison's men, who only survived because they had been sleeping with their weapons beside them, ready for their own surprise attack. Harrison's men outnumbered the Indians, but being surprised, they took heavy casualties before the sun rose. In the light of day, and the two sides saw who had the bigger force, which was Harrison's, and a cavalry charge forced the Indians to retreat. They blamed the Prophet, saying his magic had failed them. And although Harrison lost more men in the Battle of Tippecanoe, it's still regarded as an American victory because Prophetstown was abandoned and burned afterwards. And Old Tippecanoe became a nickname for William Henry Harrison. When he ran for president 29 years later, it was half his campaign slogan. So between Indian attacks, impressment, trade restrictions, and his cry of "On to Canada," President Madison felt obliged to ask Congress for a declaration of war. It was officially declared June 18, 1812, and it was remembered, therefore, as the War of 1812, although at the time was often referred to, especially by the war's opponents, as Mr. Madison's War. What no one knew in Congress was that 2 days earlier, the British had suspended their infamous Orders in Council and repealed them just a week later in hopes of avoiding conflict. But with communication being was at the time, this came too late. Now, America soon would quickly and easily conquer Canada. It's right next door, and how many Canadians are there anyway? Our big fear was that the British Navy would cut off trade and ravage the American coast. But in fact, the quick victories on land, the frightening prospects on sea, turned out to be precisely the opposite of what occurred. When the war began, the U.S. had a fairly small navy, nothing larger than a frigate, what would have been considered a fourth-rate ship in the British Navy. But what frigates we had were better than Britain's frigates. They were the best fourth-rate ships in the world. And so, our captains often sought out the chance to attack individual British ships. Ship to ship, we often could beat ships of the Royal Navy. And the first such action came on August 19, 1812, when USS Constitution sighted HMS Guerriere. At first, they fired at maximum range. Very few of their shots even hit each other. The few that hit Constitution bounced off her thick hull, earning the ship the nickname Old Ironsides. Eventually, they got very close, within pistol shot, pounded away with their broadsides until all the Guerriere's masts were shot away, and the ship was forced to surrender. Her crew were taken prisoner. The ship herself was so badly damaged, she was sunk rather than taken back to America. Whereas it was often a practice to keep captured warships to refurbish for your own navy, or possibly to sell off. This victory is a great boost to American morale, a great embarrassment to the Royal Navy. Indeed, the captain of Guerriere was court-martialed afterwards, and he explained the failure by saying the Guerriere was weak because she was herself a captured ship. As the name indicates, she was first built by the French, and a court-martial accepted this as a reason for the defeat. But America did need this victory at sea because the Army had just suffered a great defeat on land. Now, on July 12, 1812, General William Hull, based in Detroit, had invaded Canada, near modern-day Windsor, where he was stopped by the Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, as Ontario was then known, General Isaac Brock. And with the help of Indians led by Tecumseh and a Canadian militia, Brock and his British regulars pursued Hull back into the Michigan Territory, and October 16, 1812, forced Hull to surrender at Detroit, despite being outnumbered by American forces almost 2-1 during almost the entire campaign. A huge embarrassment for America. General Hull was court-martialed with the intent of sentencing him to death for this surrender, but he was eventually forgiven because of his advanced age, being a veteran of the American Revolution. Shortly afterwards, Stephen Van Rensselaer III, a New York politician, planned and led, sort of, an invasion of Canada near Niagara Falls, although he was let down by 2 other American commanders who were supposed to support him with additional invasions elsewhere, but did not. General Brock moved east from Detroit in time to stop Van Rensselaer at the Battle of Queenston Heights. Because the British had found out that an American force was coming, were able to stop the first wave of American soldiers as they crossed the Niagara River from the American side. Brock led a charge to stop them before they could be reinforced, and was killed during the charge. Van Rensselaer sent more regulars across the river under Winfield Scott, a young Army officer whom we will meet again. And he pushed the British back. Van Rensselaer tried to send a third wave to support Scott, but this wave was of militia, and they argued that they had only signed up to fight in the state of New York. They were New York militia, and they would not leave this American soil. How they had planned to invade Canada without leaving America, I'm not sure. So they did not go to reinforce Scott, and Scott was forced to retreat. When he got to the river, he found the boats that he had come over on had already gone back to get the next wave and never returned. So he and his men were captured. He was exchanged a year later with the promise he'd not invade Canada again, a promise he did not keep. So even though Americans outnumbered Canadians 6,000 to 1,300, there's a big defeat for Americans in the Battle of Queenston Heights, the first of many failed invasions of Canada. And the issue of New Yorkers not being willing to fight was part of a bigger problem for the United States. There were many Federalists in New York and New England who were opposed to the war, who would not support the war effort, at times would even quietly aid the British in the war. Now, back out west, and by west we mean Indiana, and the area around that, William Henry Harrison was sent to retake Detroit. One of the first missions he sent out, though, was ambushed by Indians along the River Raisin. Almost half the American force was killed. Many of those who surrendered were massacred in the River Raisin Massacre. Of 934 American soldiers, most of them Kentucky militiamen, only 33 escaped. And remember the Raisin would be one of America's battle cries later in the war, particularly by Westerners fighting the Indians. And Tecumseh and the British continued to push deeper into Michigan. Still, in some places our fortunes began to change, and thanks to the Navy. As the United States began building gunboats and other small warships on the Great Lakes. The British, of course, were doing the same, so America made plans to attack and destroy the British shipyards at Queenston, Canada. At the last minute, the American general, Henry Dearborn, changed the plan. He was supposed to attack the shipyards at Queenston, but instead he chose to attack York, the capital of Upper Canada. It had greater symbolic value, but much less military value than Kingston or other targets. But again, it sounded good to attack the Canadian capital. Led by Zebulon Pike, the Western explorer, Dearborn's men reached York April 27, 1813, outnumbered the British 1,700 to 700. The British evacuated the town, but blew up their supplies of gunpowder on the way out. The explosion killed many American soldiers, including General Pike himself. All of that picture is not entirely realistic, but you wouldn't want to see Pike after the actual explosion, which tore his face off. In response to this, American forces burnt the Parliament buildings, the government printing office, and many private homes. They did capture some military supplies, but not many, most having been destroyed in the explosion. It's an exciting victory, but largely a hollow one, as Dearborn soon pulled back to the United States, having gained no real military advantage, and the Canadians and British wanted revenge for the burning of their capital. Although there's an American officer who wanted revenge too, Captain Oliver Hazard Perry, recently placed in command of U.S. naval forces on Lake Erie, missed his friend, Captain James Lawrence, who had been killed in action against a British frigate in June of 1813, with the last words being, "Don't give up the ship." On Lake Erie, Perry named his flagship the Lawrence in honor of his friend, flew a flag emblazoned with the words, "Don't give up the ship," and went looking for the British, eventually encountering them. Now, in the Battle of Lake Erie, the British had longer guns, meaning guns with a longer range, but American guns fired heavier shot, if we could just get close enough to hit them at all. When the American fleet first found the British, the wind shifted, or was in the favor of the British. Perry seemed doomed. Which way the wind was blowing played a huge role in those days in how the ships could move, how quickly and how well. But at the last minute, the wind shifted to Perry's advantage, and he closed in, doing a great deal of damage to the British. Although Lawrence herself was so badly damaged, because the two largest British ships managed to hit it from both sides, and because another American ship, the Niagara, was not fighting where she was supposed to be. Until finally the Niagara moved forward, and Perry, with his flag, "Don't give up the ship," actually gave up the Lawrence, but took the flag to the Niagara, declared that to be his battleship, or his flagship, and Niagara and the badly damaged Lawrence now were able to fire at the British from both sides. And the British surrendered their entire squadron. One of the few times an entire British squadron has ever been forced to surrender. Having taken control of Lake Erie, Perry's message of victory to his commanders began, "We have met the enemy, and they are ours." And so, with Lake Erie under American control again, William Henry Harrison was ready to invade Canada again. And here he faced a British army led by General Henry Proctor, and Indian forces led by Tecumseh. Proctor knew he was outnumbered and tried to retreat, but not quickly enough. On October 5th, 1813, Harrison's army caught and defeated the British and their Indian allies at the Thames River in Canada. A great victory in the Battle of the Thames. Among Harrison's troops were 1,000 Kentucky militiamen, crying, "Remember the Raisin." And they had their revenge for the Raisin. During the battle, Tecumseh was killed. The commander of the Kentucky militia, Richard Mentor Johnson, later claimed to have shot Tecumseh personally in the battle. And when he was running for vice president with Martin Van Buren in 1836, killing Tecumseh was one of his claims to fame and campaign slogans during the election. In those days, that being viewed as a public service. Now, there's Some question whether he actually did this. Indeed, some question whether he was actually even at the battle. But he got the credit for it. And whomever did it, Tecumseh was certainly dead, and the Indians in the Northwest badly weakened. Indeed, after the Battle of the Thames, the Northwest Territory was mostly safe from attacks by the Indians and the British. But Tecumseh's allies in the South, the Creek, were still on the warpath, or at least one faction known as the Red Stick Creeks. Indeed, most American Indian nations, just like most European nations or the United States, had multiple factions. Typically amongst the Indians, there would be a faction who wanted to make peace and more or less get along for one reason or another, and another that wanted to resist or even fight back against white settlement. And both could make meaningful arguments, to be sure. The Red Stick Creek were those who wanted war. And on August 30th, 1813, they massacred 513 settlers, about half of them armed militia, the others unarmed civilians, at Fort Mims in northern Alabama. Fortunately, America was prepared to respond. As the previous year, the governor of Tennessee, Wiley Blount, half-brother to former territorial governor and Senator William Blount, had called for volunteers to invade Canada the previous year and placed him under the command of Andrew Jackson. Indeed, so many volunteers answered his call that Tennessee earned a new nickname, the Volunteer State. Partly they volunteered because, as part of his recruiting program, Andrew Jackson promised volunteers that they could see Niagara Falls on the way to invade Canada. He said that alone would make it worth marching across the continent. But President Madison did not entirely trust Andrew Jackson and did not let him invade Canada. But after the Fort Mims massacre, many of Jackson's militia were still ready to go. So Jackson marched into Alabama, defeating the Creek at Tallusahatchee and Talladega before reaching Horseshoe Bend in the Tallapoosa River, March 27, 1814. And here, as the name and the map indicate, there was a sharp bend in the Tallapoosa River. The Creek had built a fortified village there with the river behind them and on two sides to defend them, they hoped, until some Indians on Jackson's side and a few militia swam across the river, stole the Creek's canoes, and then used them to launch an invasion from behind. The landward side of the village was protected by wooden breastworks, a big heavy wooden fence. So the Creek hoped they were safe. But Jackson prepared an assault on this breastwork, and while others planned an attack across the river, among the first men over the wall were Lemuel Montgomery, who was shot dead on the spot and had Montgomery, Alabama, named in his honor, and Samuel Houston, future governor of Tennessee and of Texas, who was shot by an arrow but survived. Davy Crockett was also in the battle. The Creek, rather than being protected by the river, turned out to be trapped by it, and almost all of them were killed. The few survivors signed away most of their land, and the Creek were no longer a serious threat to the United States, although some would remain in Alabama for about 2 more decades. And in 1814, America was ready to invade Canada again. And the initial assault was placed under the command of Winfield Scott, and now free from Canadian captivity, and having promised not to invade Canada, he began to invade Canada, beginning a career as one of the greatest commanders in American military history. Although he had to be good, if he'd been caught, he would have been executed for breaking parole. He led his men across the Niagara River in July of 1814. As he reached the shore, he jumped out of the boat and disappeared into an underwater hole. Very embarrassing, but he was rescued, led his men ashore, and were joined by other brigades who marched north. July 5th, 1814, Scott's brigade was in the lead when the British attacked a place called Chippewa. And Scott's men surprised the British. He was actually leading a unit of voltigeurs, he called them, modeled after French soldiers, who, because they were supposed to be an elite unit, were wearing a different uniform, a gray uniform, rather than the standard blue uniform of the U.S. Army. Because they weren't in blue, the Canadians assumed they were militia and assumed they would be poor soldiers, when in fact they were highly trained, and defeated the British. Indeed, at Chippewa, Americans for the first time won a major battle against British regulars in Canada. Scott became a national hero, would eventually rise to command the entire U.S. Army. Scott was sent further ahead, and he was not yet the overall commander, but in command of the leading units. July 25th, he spoke to a local widow who owned a tavern, and she warned him there were 1,000 British soldiers waiting with 2 cannons not far ahead at a place called Lundy's Lane. But Scott did not believe her, because some earlier attempts to get information from Canadians had led to false information fooling our men. But this widow told the truth. So despite having been warned there were British soldiers at Lundy's Lane, Scott was surprised when he actually ran into them. But rather than retreat, he sent for reinforcements who arrived at the last minute to charge into what would turn out to be the bloodiest battle of the war. A slaughter for both sides, much of the fighting being at close quarters, producing such gruesome results that even veterans of the Napoleonic Wars who had come from Europe to fight in Canada were horrified. Some men charging right up to the mouths of the enemy cannons and being blasted apart. The fighting continued through the night. Some men fired on their own army's units in the dark because they couldn't see. At one point, Scott's men were being fired on by both sides at once. Eventually, the British were driven back. So technically an American victory on the battlefield, but our losses were so heavy that we began pulling back after this. So in the grand scheme of things, another failed invasion of Canada. And out of 3,500 British soldiers there, over 800 were killed or wounded. Of 2,500 Americans, again, about 800 killed or wounded. American forces began pulling back, although would hold on to a few parts of Canada, not far from Niagara Falls, for a few months to come, but eventually abandoned those as well. And so, Britain now considered invading America, the Canadians having had enough of this. The Governor-General of Canada, George Prévost, assembled 11,000 men, and many of them veterans of the fighting in Europe, and began marching into New York, feeding them with beef purchased from Federalist farmers in New York and Vermont, who liked the British better than they liked Madison's Republican Party. And the British Navy already controlled the northern half of Lake Champlain, which is traditionally a major invasion route between the U.S. and Canada. So Prévost planned to sail down the lake and get control of the whole thing, while also having his army march alongside the lake. The British did have a bigger fleet on Lake Champlain, but the American fleet could afford to wait for them. The British, trying to rush things, sailed out with some of their ships barely finished. And the plan was for the Navy and the Army to together fight at Plattsburgh. So what follows is sometimes called the Battle of Plattsburgh, after a small town on Lake Champlain, or the Battle of Lake Champlain, or the Battle of Plattsburgh Bay, kind of combining the two. As the British sailed into Plattsburgh Bay, September 11th, 1814, their first volley only managed to strike a single American ship, hitting the flagship, in fact, but it didn't damage the ship. It hit a cage with a rooster in it. The cage burst open, the rooster jumped out and began to crow, and the men on the ship began to cheer too. And then, as the British were sailing into the bay, the wind died, leaving the British ships to drift at the mercy of the Americans. Indeed, one British ship drifted entirely off course, running aground on a small island. Another ship's sails were so badly damaged, it just drifted through the American lines to be fired at with no way to respond. Of the 4 main British ships, only two were really able to fight America's four main ships, each side having four relatively large ships and a number of small gunboats. Now, the British flagship Confidence had a furnace on board to heat up iron, to make hot shot, as they called it, and they set the American flagship on fire twice. Both the main American ships were so badly damaged on the side facing the British, they could barely fire. At last, one of them, the Erie, cut her anchor cable and managed to turn around and begin drifting down the line, now firing her undamaged side at the British. And on the Saratoga, the flagship, Captain Thomas MacDonough, commander of the whole squadron, also cut the anchor chain, but dropped another anchor on the other end of the ship and used winches to turn the ship around in place, now firing on the British with the undamaged side of his ship. The British commander had already been killed by this point. His second in command surrendered the flagship, which was sinking fast, and soon the other major British ships surrendered as well. And the British army under Prévost, that was supposed to attack American forces in Plattsburgh but hadn't yet done so, now withdrew. And this great American victory and the Battle of Lake Champlain, or at Plattsburgh, convinced the British to consider discussing peace terms on terms more acceptable to America. Negotiations had been going on for some time, but things had been going so well for the British that they weren't willing to consider some of what we wanted. And to be fair, America had not been doing so well otherwise. Of course, our invasions of Canada had all failed, and another British invasion of the United States seemed to be going quite well. August 24th, 1814, British forces landed in Maryland and defeated the U.S. Army at Bladensburg. Even though Americans outnumbered the British 6,900 to 4,500, almost all the Americans were inexperienced militia, while most of the British were veterans from Europe, and one unit was a unit of freed American slaves, many of whom settled in Trinidad and other parts of the Caribbean after the war. So while 400 American sailors and Marines tried to hold off the British, most of the militia broke and ran as soon as they came under fire, including their commander, William Winder. The Battle of Bladensburg is sometimes called the Bladensburg Races, because American forces ran away so fast. The British then marched to Washington, D.C., which they burned in retaliation for the destruction of York in Canada the year before. Dolley Madison managed to preserve the portrait of George Washington in the White House by breaking it out of the frame and carrying it out before the White House was set on fire. But the rest of the structure was badly damaged. The British set fire to the Capitol building and to the White House and to many other public buildings, although the superintendent of patents convinced the British the patent office was too valuable to all of humanity to be burnt. Burning the patent office, he said, would be a crime against science. Fortunately, though, a hurricane and a tornado blew through Washington a few hours later, putting out many of the fires and even killing a number of British soldiers who withdrew. But only leaving Washington, they really hoped to capture Baltimore, and landed 5,000 troops in Maryland and marched towards Baltimore, fighting American forces along the way, but mainly waiting for the British Navy to destroy Fort McHenry, which protected Baltimore Harbor. Not till Fort McHenry was destroyed did the British plan to march into Baltimore itself. And so, September 13th, the British began a 25-hour bombardment of the fort, firing mortars, cannonballs that went up really high and came down in an arc to get over the fort walls, some of which were designed to explode, which they described as bombs. They also fired a pretty new weapon called a Congreve Rocket, essentially a huge bottle rocket, which were first used during the Napoleonic Wars. And both sides were firing at extreme long range, mostly beyond Fort McHenry's range completely. The fact is, neither side really did the other much damage, before the British finally gave up and withdrew. But the battle is significant because along with the Battle of Lake Champlain, it allowed American diplomats to negotiate from a stronger position in Europe. And it's famous for another reason, because you all know the story of Fort McHenry, whether or not you know the story of Fort McHenry. And that is because before the battle began, a lawyer from Baltimore had gone to try to speak to British officers and talk them out of attacking the city. The British decided to keep him till after the battle in case he was a spy. And through the night, as he watched the battle, or tried to watch it in the darkness, he could see the red glare of the Congreve rockets. He could see the bombs from those mortars bursting the air above the fort. But in the morning, by the dawn's early light, the Star-Spangled Banner was still there. The lawyer, Francis Scott Key, wrote a poem, The Defense of Fort McHenry, which was set to a popular drinking song and eventually became our national anthem. Still, some Americans were doubtful that we could win the war, and a lot were tired of it, especially in New England, where merchants were suffering badly from the loss of trade with Britain. And so, in December 1814, delegates from Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island met in Hartford, Connecticut, to discuss what New England might do about this. Their discussions were secret, but at least some delegates discussed the possibility of seceding from the Union. They didn't do it, but having even contemplated it earned them, and thus the Federalist Party, a reputation as traitors, which would effectively destroy the Federalist Party after the war. And once again, we see how slow communication made a big difference, or rather prevented things from making a difference. Because unknown to the delegates at the Hartford Convention, by the time their meeting was over, the war was over too. The Treaty of Ghent had officially ended the war Christmas Eve, 1814, ending it with the status quo ante bellum, Latin for the way things were before the war. Essentially a draw, no land changing hands. But the Hartford delegates were not the only people who did not know the war was over. Neither did the British general, Sir Edward Pakenham, who was in the process of invading Louisiana. Nor was it known by Old Hickory, as Andrew Jackson had come to be known, being said he was as tough as hickory wood. And it was his job to defend New Orleans from a much larger British force. And Pakenham had about 11,000 veterans of the wars in Europe. Jackson had about 4,000 men, some regular soldiers, some militia, including Tennesseans, and Kentuckians and others, some Choctaw Indians, New Orleans gamblers ready to fight with their pistols, and a group of pirates led by Jean Lafitte, who was able to guide Jackson's men through the swamps and harass the British in a difficult watery territory around New Orleans. Pakenham marched up the Mississippi River. Jackson's men built earthworks perpendicular to the river, partly out of heavy cotton bales. Pakenham suffered repeated delays that prevented him from making the pre-dawn assault he had hoped to make January 8, 1815. He had hoped that his men could move in under cover of darkness and under the cover of the fog that was usually there in the early mornings along the Mississippi River, but by the time his men were really underway, the fog had melted away under the hot sun. He ordered his men to charge Jackson's, but they were cut down by repeated volleys as they approached. When a few finally reached the barricades, they discovered the men who were supposed to have brought the scaling ladders with them had not done so. So the few who got to the wall couldn't even climb over it, or at least very few. Some managed to climb up without ladders, but were simply killed by the men at the top. Pakenham himself was killed, leading one of the last charges against the wall. Over 2,000 British soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured, while Jackson only lost 13 men killed and 58 wounded. Jackson was hailed as a national hero. And so, 2 weeks after the peace treaty was signed, the War of 1812 was over. And the U.S. and Britain would negotiate further treaties afterwards, to try to deal with some of the issues that had sparked the war. In 1817, the Rush-Bagot Treaty limited the number of warships the U.S. and Britain would keep on the Great Lakes. The next year, the Treaty of 1818 settled the border between the United States and Canada at the 49th parallel, 49 degrees north latitude, at least as far west as the Rocky Mountains, because that's how far Louisiana went anyway. We can all just share Oregon, hopefully. And although several incidents over the next few decades brought the United States and Canada close to war, obviously war never broke out. And today, the United States and Canada enjoy the longest unfortified border in the world. But even though the Treaty of Ghent ended the war without changing any borders, or even officially ending Britain's policies of impressing sailors or harassing American ships, and some people felt America had fought for 3 years for nothing. For many, it seemed the war had shown the United States could unite in a common cause. Victories like those on Lake Erie, Lake Champlain, and especially the crowning victory at New Orleans showed the United States could stand up to the mightiest empire on earth, had demonstrated we were truly an independent country. Sometimes the War of 1812 has even been described as the Second War of American Independence.